Okay, everyone, thanks for joining. I think we're going to get started here. My name is Rich Ezzo. I head up sales and marketing at Catalyst. Welcome to the, which is hard to believe, the third quarter version of Patent Watch. We're already into the third quarter, and it's only summer. So thank you for joining. For those of you who join often, this will be a review, but if you're new, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what Patent Watch is. This is a quarterly webinar that we do, and we like to analyze patents that are filed by some of the internet giants, as you'll see, Microsoft, Google. This is a practice we started internally, actually, at one point, and we thought the information was valuable enough to make it available publicly. So now we host these as a webinar. We do record these, so if you're interested in looking at any of the past ones, you can find them on our YouTube channel, which is Catalyst SEM, and the topics are listed there below. There's probably some others, but those are the most recent. This one as well will be recorded. Today's format, so we're going to do a 30-minute patent watch analysis, or patent analysis. During that, you'll learn why this patent was formulated and filed, as well as a neat little trivia as to why it's named Panda, so listen for that. Then we'll go into a Q&A session. If you do have questions, please simply put those into the chat area, and I will read those out, and our host will answer. Who is our host? Dan Cristo. So Dan hosts all of our patent watches. He's the one who does the analysis. He is our director of SEO Innovation, and he actually created the patent watch. He was the one who started this whole process of trying to figure out where these internet giants were headed. You can read him. He is featured as one of our co-authors on Mastering the Art of Social SEO. He's also a featured author in a number of publications, including Marketing Land and Search Engine Watch. He does a monthly publication in authoring, so you can look for him there. He speaks at a number of conferences, including this weekend, Dan. I believe, if you want to give a plug, aren't you heading to sunny Florida in the middle of July? Or not?
Can you hear me?
Oh, I couldn't. Yeah, but you're there now.
Yeah, so I'm going to sunny Orlando, Florida for a bloggers conference. Should be pretty good.
Wow. That's cool. All right, so Dan, thanks for joining. Interesting, the topic is Panda. So I think one of the first questions people might ask is, why are we doing a patent watch on Panda, which was something that was released back in 2011 or so. How come today?
Well, the algorithm, you're right, the algorithm was released back in 2011. The patent itself wasn't published publicly until a few months ago. So as soon as we were able to get our hands on it, that's when we dove in, and this was the next patent watch we had available, so that's why we're doing it now.
Okay, terrific. All right, if you want to take it away, I'll join towards the end for the Q&A session.
Perfect. Thank you for the intro. Let's get this going. Okay. All right, so we are talking about the Panda patent, which is it's exciting for anyone who's been in the SEO industry for a while because it's such a famous patent. I would say between Panda and Penguin, Panda is probably the most well-known patent of Google's out there, and even people who aren't familiar in the SEO space know about it. But what's very interesting about this patent is it's a little bit different than the actual algorithm that we've all known to love. So in 2001, we actually date back to where this all started, because in 2001, that's when webmasters, that was the term back in the day, really started to pick up on this SEO thing and started to manipulate the search engines through link exchanges, link buying, blog networks, content farms, etc. Now, there had been black hat SEO tactics before that, but they were mostly focused on keyword stuffing, hidden text, doorway pages. This new form of black hat SEO with the content farming was really manipulating Google's results. So Google had sat down, they got their brains together, and they said, how do we counteract these issues? And that was the beginning of what spurred this patent. So in 2011, when Google announced the Panda update, what they explained was that we released the major algorithm update. It was designed, as you can see on the right, to reduce rankings for low-quality websites. So they were really targeting the spammers more than anyone else. And you can read through the actual announcement. It's a pretty interesting yet generic announcement. And it wasn't until a couple months after, when the update had hit so many people, that they start to really dive into the details of what's actually happening and how do you recover from this update and what sort of quality changes do you need to implement on your website. So why was this patent named Panda? Most people think because of the animal, but actually it was named Panda because of a Google engineer whose last name was Panda. And you could check his Google Plus profile. In the bragging rights section, he actually refers to himself as the author of the Google Panda update to penalize low-quality content. That little bragging rights section has since been removed. So you won't see it there, but we have a screenshot of the engineer. But let's dive into the actual patent. So first, we need to understand the timeline of all this activity. The patent was filed in September of 2012. And as I mentioned before, it was granted in March of this year. So there was a span of a couple of years between when the patent was actually submitted and when it was published and we could see what was going on. I know the infographic is a little bit small, but this is a chart from 2011 to April 2012, where it would have a timeline of all the Panda updates. And you can see that even though the patent was submitted to the U.S. Patent Office in September 2012, the actual announcement that the algorithm was in place was 2011. So that you have a time span where Google had taken the findings or the learnings from the patent, had implemented it before it even filed for the patent itself, and of course years before it was actually granted. So this serves to just give a little bit of a mindset of how sometimes Google works with these patents. A word about the patent itself. You guys can go check it out. It's very easy to search for Panda patent, and there'll be all sorts of links to download the actual patent. But let me tell you, it is a very dry read, and that's coming from someone who likes to read patents. It is a very boring, dry read. So the best way to approach this, I think, is to break it down. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about a few special terms that are used in this patent over and over again and how they apply to the patent. And then we're going to dive into the core of the patent, which is this modification engine idea. And we're going to talk about how does the Panda modification engine work, how does the actual adjustment take place, what are the results on it, and then we'll look at a few of the winners and losers of the first patent. And then we'll step back and we'll talk about what does this patent mean for us, what can we take away from it, even though it's several years after the first patent, and we'll go from there. We'll do some Q&A. So let's get a few of those technical terms defined. The first term we're going to look at is a resource. And a resource is just about anything online. It could be a web page, could be an image, could be a video, could be an audio document. And this actually dates back to the early days of the internet. So you're all familiar with a URL, right? URL actually stands for Uniform Resource Locator. And the idea of a URL is to tell the browser where that particular resource is located on the internet. So typically it's a domain like catalystsearchmarketing.com/Panda Patent Watch. That's going to tell the browser that this resource, the Panda Patent Watch webpage, exists under this domain of catalystsearchmarketing.com. And the original purpose of having domains, especially top-level domains like .gov and .edu, was to categorize resources. So this set of web resources belong to the government, and this set belonged to educational universities, and this set belonged to commercial entities. So that was the point of a resource. And then they ended up grouping resources together, and they say this group of resources belongs to a particular domain, for example. So all the pages on catalystsearchmarketing.com belong to the domain of catalystsearchmarketing.com. So it's a group, and it's important to understand because the way patent works is it's going to treat a particular individual resource a little bit differently based on the group it belongs to. So again, an individual resource is a website. A group of resources can be a web page, and a group of resources can be a website. Now, the third term I want to identify is independent links. So we're all familiar with how a link works. It's when one web page has a hyperlink to another web page. But this concept of independent links was introduced by this engineer, Panda, and what he wanted to say was there's a difference between a link from one website to another website if they're both owned by the same person or the same company. So let's look at an example. News Corp. We're all familiar with News Corp because they bought MySpace back in the day, and they own millions, I don't know about millions, but they own a lot of various publications, news outlets. One of them they own is New York Post, and another one they own is the Wall Street Journal. So these are two groups of resources, these websites, and if the New York Post, if the page on the New York Post linked to a page on the Wall Street Journal, it would not be an independent link because both of these groups of resources are owned by the same entity. So what Google wanted to do here is they wanted to reward when one link that's truly independent of the target link or site. So basically, if I own a bunch of sites, if my sites interlink to each other, it's not as valuable because it's not an independent link. And this is the concept behind content farms. Now let's look at implied links. So an implied link exists when there is not technically a hyperlink in place, but it is implied that there should be a link in place. So for example, let's say I'm writing a blog post and I mention Catalyst Search Marketing, but there's no link, so the user can't actually click on the text and navigate there. But Google knows that it's an implied link. There should be a link there. This is also called co-citation. Moz has had a lot of information about co-citations where there's mentions and citations, but not necessarily a link. So here's an example with the Wall Street Journal where they covered an article on Google acquiring Skybox. And within the post, Skybox was actually mentioned quite a number of times, but there was no link to skybox.com. This is where Google would say, okay, this is an implied link because it's referencing or citing another website without actually putting a hyperlink in place. Reference query is one of the last terms that we need to define well. So a reference query is when someone inputs a query into a search engine and they want to reference a particular site or a resource. So here we are, for example, if I were to put in Skybox or Skybox acquisition, here Google knows that I'm really referencing skybox.com, and it's a query that's referencing it. So it's considered a reference query, and we'll dive into why that's important. But it's basically a search in Google that refers to an existing website. Now let's get into the actual guts of the patent, which is the Panda modification engine. And we'll see how this engine uses all those terms that we just discussed. So here's the flow of a typical search being done on Google before the Panda algorithm takes place. Let's walk through it. First step is a user puts in a query. In this case, we'll use dogs as the query. That query is sent to Google, and Google looks up the word dogs or whatever the query was, and it looks it up based on an index. And you're all familiar with how index works. If you look at like a back of a book and you want to look up what page dogs are mentioned on, it's going to give you a list of pages. That's exactly how a search engine works. So they look up dogs in the index and they get a list of URLs or web pages that the term dogs exists on. Now they need to get a ranking score for all those pages. So they access another part of the Google algorithm that has a ranking score for that page relative to dogs. And I'm just using sample data here, but in this case, we'll say that the ranking score for doggy.com was 78, petstore.com was 92, and YouTube.com was 87. And then Google orders the results based on the ranking score. And again, ranking score in general is based on relevancy and quality. So they reorder the results, and since petscore.com had the highest ranking score, it's going to be ranked in the top position. And then it's going to return that list to the user in the form of a set of search end results. That's the pre-Panda search experience. The post-Panda search experience starts off very similar. The user puts in the term dogs. It hits the index to get a list of websites relevant to dogs. It grabs the ranking score, but now there's a modification that happens to that ranking score, what we'll call the Panda factor. That's not what it's referred to in the patent, but for this case, we'll call it the Panda factor. And what that does is it adjusts the ranking score before those results are ordered and sent back to the user. And then based on that new modified ranking score, you have a different order of results. And in this case, YouTube.com ranked higher than Doggy.com and Petstore.com, so the list of search results are different. That's what the user is seeing after the Panda algorithm took place. So what is this modification factor and how does it work? And again, this is all according to the Panda patent, not necessarily the final Panda algorithm that we've seen take place. But according to the Panda patent, here is the flow that happens. First off, the search engine receives a query, and then it identifies a resource and the initial score for the resource. That's the first box here. Then it finds what domain or group of resources that particular resource belongs to. And based on that domain or group of resources, it applies a modification factor to that individual page or resource based on the domain or group. So it applies that modification factor, it generates a new modification factor, and then reorders the results. So this workflow we're seeing right now is a screenshot from the patent, and it's essentially what I just walked through earlier. And the way it works is very similar to the last patent watch we did on page speed. So on page speed, what happened here was there was a search for something like fuel-efficient cars. It would hit that index, and they would pull a ranking score. In this example, we're saying a relevancy score for all those pages. And then Google would apply an adjustment engine, is what they called it in the last. And the adjustment engine was based on the page load speed. So the faster your page load speed, the higher, you can see at the bottom, this speed multiplier effect. So if you had a very fast page speed, it would multiply your rankings higher. And if you had a slow page speed, it would multiply your rankings lower. It's using the same methodology. And then it would deliver an adjusted search results based on those multiplier effects. Now, with Panda, it's using that same multiplier or modification score, but instead of using page speed as the criteria that's going to apply the multiplier, it's using links, citations, and queries, which were the things that we identified and looked at the definition of early on. So let's see from the patent how Google is actually creating this modification factor. First off, it's taking a look at the number of independent links pointing to a group of resources. In layman's terms, it's saying how many independent links are pointing to a domain. Based on, so they take that number and they hold it, and then they say, let's also take a look at how many reference queries are referring to that domain as well. And again, reference queries are search queries in the search box. Based on the independent links, the implied links, which are those citations, and the reference queries, it's going to type that into an equation and generate a modification factor score for the domain. And that's the modification factor that's going to get applied to all the pages within a domain. We can see this sort of laid out visually. You've got a list of resources on the left. You've got the initial ranking score, which we'll just refer to as relevancy score, and that's the way they normally order it. Then we're taking a count of all the independent links pointing to the domain, and we're applying, this also includes reference queries and implied links. And then we're applying this Panda multiplier effect, which is ultimately going to adjust the ranking score. And that's why we're seeing a set of reordered results. So just like the page speed, not all queries are affected by this Panda multiplier. If you remember from the page speed, there were certain types of queries like weather that weren't affected, and definitions, those type of things weren't affected. Now, this is going to be a little bit hard for you guys to read, but let me just walk you through how Google determines what queries are going to be affected by the Panda multiplier. So the first question Google asks when it gets a query is this query a navigational type query? So if I were to go to Google and I were to put in facebook.com into Google, Google would say, clearly this is a navigational type query. So if this query is a navigational query, then we go to the right and we set the modification score to not modify the score. What that means is navigational queries are not affected by Panda. If it's not a navigational query, then we move on to the next criteria. And it asks, is the initial score, that initial ranking or relevancy score, for the resource or web page below the first threshold? So what does that mean, first threshold? So Google has a threshold, and you could think of it as a ranking threshold in place to say if it's above a certain ranking, it is or is not going to be affected, or if it's below a certain ranking, it is or is not going to be affected. So it's asking, is the initial ranking score for the resource ranking below a certain threshold? If it is ranking below a certain threshold, then don't apply the Panda modification score. What this means is it's saying, let's say the threshold was the 10th search result, so essentially the first page. If this web page ranked below the first page, then don't apply the Panda modification score, because really the purpose of this was to target really high-ranking spammy websites. So then it goes below. Okay, so the website was ranking on the first page higher than the first threshold. So then it asks, is the score for the resource below a second threshold? So let's say that second threshold is the number 5 ranking, or the 5th ranking spot. If it's below the 5th ranking, so it's in position 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, then generate a first modification score. And that modification score is going to be a little softer than if the resource actually ranked in position number 1. Then it's going to be hit a little bit harder by that Panda modification score. So that's the flow it's using to determine if this is a type of query that should be affected by Panda, and if it is a type of query that should be affected by Panda, where does it currently rank to see how severe that Panda algorithm is going to hit it. Now, let's take a look at some of the winners and losers of that first Panda algorithm. And remember, the algorithm is going to be a little bit different than the patent itself, but let's see what exactly happened. So we're going to take a look at two data sets. One is the Sysrex data set, and one is a data set from Search Metrics. And it looked at the big winners from Panda. And we could call out a few of the top ones. So you got Sears.com in the 4th position, Dailymotion in the around 6th or 7th position, which is a video site similar to YouTube. Etsy, which is around number 10, very popular e-commerce website. And then on the Search Metrics data set, you've got WikiHow, you've got Yahoo Answers, you've got eHow. These were the big winners from the Panda 1.0, Facebook. And then if we look at the losers, now you've got WiseGeek.com, eZineArticles.com, I'm just reading that, HubPages.com, Buzzle.com. And if you look on the right side of the Search Metrics, you've got Flipper.com, Suite 101, TradeKeep. Right off the bat, one thing that jumps out at me, let me go back a slide, is you can see that the winners have pretty strong brand names. And the losers, you've probably never heard of any of these. And this is a combination of independent links, reference queries, and implied links. think of reference queries alone. No one is searching for suite101.com in their query. They don't care what Suite 101 is. They don't know what that is. But if we go back, they know what Dailymotion is. They know what eHow is. They know what Facebook is and some of these other ones. So obviously branding is a huge piece. And those websites that did not have a strong brand but had a lot of non-independent links, those are the ones that certainly got hit. So based on those winners and losers, Moz had a really great original analysis. This was done about a month or two after the first Panda hit. And what they first looked at was the link metrics of the domain level. And they said that based on Citrix data sets, which we just looked at, it suggests that broadly, links are probably still important for large domains seeking to rank large quantities of content. So they basically had the same thing as we just said, where links are an important factor for big brand domains. Now, if you look at the second bullet point, you may recall that Panda was originally called Farmer. It was called Farmer because the big ones that got hit were content farms. And so one thing they mentioned was that they were suggesting that link metrics are no longer as important or as predictive of high-level rankings as they were before Panda had rolled out. So clearly, this was something that affected the linking and backlinking structure of the website. The third bullet point is that they didn't think that paid links or spammy links was necessarily the lead culprit here. We did find out that when the Penguin update came, paid links, spammy links, those were the main culprit. But for Farmer, it was a little bit different, and we all know now that content quality was the leading reason why these sites got hit. The fourth assumption that they had made early on was that there was a correlation between the distribution of links to the home page versus the distribution of links to internal pages. And this sort of makes sense with what we've been talking, because the way Panda works is it's looking at the implied links, independent links, and reference queries to the domain as a whole, that group of resources, and was affecting every page underneath there. So say you were affected by the Farmer/Panda update, and you said, all right, these couple pages are really spammy. I know that. I'm sorry, Google. I'm going to delete them and create new ones. That's not going to really fix the problem, because the penalty was actually applied to the whole domain or the group of resources as a whole. So let's walk through the patent in terms of, we know the goal of patent, because Google told us, or the goal of the Panda update was to really hit low-quality websites. And what Google was trying to counteract was content farms that were dominating search results. Content farms that had a ton of pages, but they were low-quality pages. A lot of times they would, these popular content-based websites would mine queries on Google and then automatically generate responses to them. Quality was not a factor for these sites, meaning that their intention wasn't to create a great quality answer. Their intention was to create content that ranked well, that drove traffic, so they can get ad revenue. These content farms also had really weak brands, and Google saw that as a problem, because content farms that don't have any branding, they don't have the trust factor that a lot of these more respectable websites had. And then lastly, there was a really poor search experience from people landing on one of these content farms, finding a really thin, poor answer, and then having to go back and research for another solution. So this Panda, when it was written, the goal here was to identify websites that had links from other properties that the site owner owned, and really penalize and crack down on that website. And you may recall content farms back in the day where you could create a blog network. And I would create like 15 or 20 blogs, and I would put some content on all those blogs, and then I would link them together to try to boost the page rank of some key blogs, and then you could point those key blogs through links and pass that page rank to clients. So even if the individual spammy blogs were affected, your client would not be affected. This is exactly the patent that was meant to crack down on that exploitation. There's a brand factor in place. So Google wanted to, I want to say bless websites, really improve the rankings for websites that had a strong, trustworthy brand. And they wanted to, and then once they understood, okay, these are the things, these independent links, these citations that really affect quality, they created a score and an algorithm based on that to penalize sites that were falling foul of it. And then, of course, they adjusted rankings based on that modification score. So that's the Panda patent flow through. If you were to read the patent, that's what you would get from it. But really, what should you take away? It's been a few years since the patent came up. It's really interesting learning. But I think the big takeaways that I saw from this patent was that the actual algorithm, the Panda algorithm, has evolved. Every month, there's a new evolution of it. And it uses more than just this patent. It uses ideas and principles from this patent. But the algorithm itself is actually many ideas and many patents combined into one, and then they take that and they test it quite a bit. And then the final patent you see may only reflect certain pieces of this, the final algorithm may only reflect certain pieces of this patent. And that's what I think we're seeing with here. The second big takeaway here is don't focus just on link building, but instead focus on brand building. And if you're doing brand building correctly, there should naturally be links coming to you. And they're the type of links that are going to be rewarded, such as independent links and co-citations. The third piece here is that the patent itself talks about improving search quality. If you're hit, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person or you did something wrong. It just means that you need to focus on the types of things that improve quality. Stronger brands, more mentions on websites, other websites, social media, user engagement, that's a piece too. All those other types of quality signals. So you don't necessarily need to take down your old website. We know this because it's been out for a few years, but it's really just focusing on incremental improvements in the quality of your content and your website. That was the Panda patent. Rich, did we want to jump into the QA portion?
Yes, thanks, Dan. That was great. There's several questions in here. I'm probably going to paraphrase just to make it easier. One question interesting. You had mentioned News Corp earlier, having owned the Post and Wall Street Journal. How is it that Google figures that out? How do they know?
How is it that Google?
How do they know that it's owned by a parent like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We need to remember that Google is itself a domain registrar. So they know whenever any domain changes take place. So just based on the contact details of the domain register, they're going to be able to put together who owns what. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is they're extremely good at natural language analysis. So by looking at the footer of a web page and the about page, they can determine is there the same company mentioned over and over again on these certain websites. Another thing they do is they actually look at the structure of the page and they go down to even the structure of the CSS. I don't recall if they looked at the JavaScript. I don't think so. I think it was more about the style sheet of the page. And they compare page structure, HTML structure, style sheet, and design structure across the various sites that it thinks are similar domain. And if they find a consistent match, then chances are that they're owned by the same person. And this really is effective against blog networks, because if you've got a blog network, it's very easy to just spin up a similar template on all the networks. Maybe you got all the themes or the templates from one source, and you just bought them all there. So there's going to be similarities both on the page itself as well as the technical back end of the domain.
Okay. That was a great question and a great answer. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, good question.
So another question here around almost best practices. If one was doing influencer outreach or experience views, how would you navigate this?
In terms of how would we make sure that influencers or bloggers or people creating content don't violate some of the findings of the patent?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Google wants any sort of relationship disclosed. So if I want to work with a blogger or an influencer, they should disclose that they're getting compensated in some way to work with me. And they'll have a disclaimer, and all the links should be no-followed. And I can't remember if there was a third piece that Google asks for. At any rate, the no-follow piece is the most important. Oh, there should be some sort of sponsored verbiage next to it. So that tells Google that this is a sponsored post or a sponsored link or whatnot. But in terms of co-citations or implied links, there's really no way to no-follow an implied link. And if you don't have any links and you don't have any disclosure, those co-citations can still be counted as implied links. And Google has no way of knowing whether or not a paid relationship was in place. Likewise, you could use Mechanical Turk, or you could hire a bunch of people to type in your brand name in Google to boost up your reference queries to try to build your brand authority. That's also, it's difficult for Google to identify that that's taking place, and it's effective. People have shown that you can change the auto-suggest that Google recommends in the search box by having people manipulate that. But they do have some anti-spam measures in place. They're going to take a look at where all these requests are coming from, the IP addresses. So if you were really determined and were very smart about it, you could get around that. Ultimately, it's like SEO in general. If you are really smart and you really try to make it very natural sounding, there's ways where you could manipulate the algorithm, and you could benefit from knowing how reference queries and implied links and co-citations are independent links, how they work, and you can manipulate the algorithm. But ultimately, you're almost better off spending that energy and money and time on real brand building efforts and having real word of mouth conversations and real social media mentions and creating great quality content. And that's why the push for SEO has been about quality content and getting that content distributed, because you're going to get those independent links and brand mentions naturally.
Okay. Great. Similar, related here is, what about social linking? Can Google tell if all of the social assets are yours, even if they have different names and things?
Yeah, great question. Google likes to say that they treat social properties like Facebook and Twitter the same as any other web page. So whatever information they can publicly crawl on Facebook and Twitter, they're going to treat that the same as if it was mentioned on a blog. They don't have any special access to an API, although they did at one point with Twitter. But today, they don't have any special access. So they're not able to see whether or not you own certain profiles and those are linked together, apart from what's publicly linking and pointing to each other. But Google has been pushing for their authorship for years. And even though we're going to have a SEO Hub conversation on authorship, I think today, right after this, Google's not abandoning authorship. They're just tweaking how it's showing up in the display, in the search results. That's what we're talking about today is SEO Hub. But Google really wants to know who the author is of the post. So they want you to create your Google Plus profile. They want you to connect your blog and your social profiles to Google Plus profile, so they know what domains you own, what content you own, and who is the author of that content. So that's the way Google has chosen to do it, is by pushing the authorship markup and the authorship approach. Although it's not widely accepted, I think we can all agree it's not widely accepted yet, so there's still quite a bit of struggle on how Google can accurately determine what content you own and what websites you really own. And like I said before, if you're really smart and you really try to make it look natural, you can obviously get around that sort of ownership radar of Google's.
Right. Okay. Cool. Another question is there any evidence that Yahoo Bing will be following suit or already has?
That's a really good question. So yes, in the sense that Bing has always tried to keep up with Google. And we have to acknowledge that the Panda algorithm update was a pretty severe update for Google and a very good update. And I think Penguin was a very good update in general as well. And Bing has, on their end, needed to reflect those same quality controls in place. And of course, Bing has access to the patents that we have access to, and engineers at Microsoft, I'm certain, have very similar methodologies on how they're approaching independent links and co-citations and reference queries. These aren't necessarily new or advanced factors for search engine engineers. They're just interesting to us because we don't typically think of reference queries and implied links as ranking signals. So I'm sure Microsoft has known about this for a while. They've tweaked their own algorithm, and I would find the quality very similar in terms of search results. So I'm sure that Panda equivalent algorithm is already in place on Microsoft's side, although they probably named it after a different engineer or whatever they did.
Okay, terrific. Hey, Dan, I really appreciate it and appreciate all the questions. We're a little past here, our 45 minutes, but really interesting stuff. Again, this is recorded, so if anybody wants to take a deeper dive and listen to it again, it'll be on our YouTube channel. The next Patent Watch will be coming out sometime early Q4. We look forward to the next topic you come up with, Dan.
Yeah, thanks.
And good luck this weekend. So thank you all for joining, and we'll speak to you in the fourth quarter. Have a great summer.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.